The first thing that went up in flames was not a warehouse and not a tank. It was the A-60, the experimental Russian jet that carries a laser designed to destroy satellites. A one-of-a-kind aircraft, impossible to replace, and one that Russia believed was untouchable. But when the hangars in Taganrog exploded, it became clear that Ukraine had just opened a door Moscow can no longer close. Precise deep strikes using only national technology. And while the Kremlin was still trying to understand what was happening, strategic ports, ships, and even Russia's civilian alert system began to collapse. Today, you are going to see how Ukraine dismantled, in a single night, 3 pillars of the Russian war machine. The explosion in Taganrog did not happen in a vacuum. It was the clearest possible response to the posture Moscow had been taking in recent weeks. Putin and Lavrov kept repeating the same arrogant line: accept the occupation, or Russia will take even more. It was a direct threat, almost an ultimatum. The message was simple: either Ukraine gave in, or it would pay dearly on the battlefield. At the same time, Donald Trump's so-called peace plan began to appear. A proposal that, in practice, put pressure on Zelensky to negotiate quickly, accept concessions, and end the war before the international political landscape shifted. Washington wanted to sit at the table. Europe wanted stability. But Kyiv knew that negotiating at that moment would mean talking with a knife to its throat. And that was when the decision Moscow least expected arrived. Zelensky did not answer with speeches or diplomatic statements. The response came in the most direct way possible. Deep, surgical strikes with a 100% Ukrainian signature. The message to everyone, Russia, Trump, allies, was crystal clear. We are not entering negotiations weakened. First, you are going to feel the cost of this war. This is the instant karma that took shape in Taganrog, Novorossiysk, and even in the chaos of the hacked sirens. While the Kremlin tried to impose fear and force an agreement, Ukraine dismantled 3 pillars of the Russian war machine in a single night: strategic technology, energy-driven economic power, and internal stability. And the most provocative part is that this was only the beginning. Because what happened to the A-60 was not just an attack, it was the warning. To understand the real impact of the strike, you first need to look at where it happened. Taganrog is not just a simple military facility, it is the Beriev complex, one of the most sensitive sites in all of Russian aviation. They do not assemble aircraft there, they create, upgrade, and maintain everything Russia has that is rare and technically delicate. Beriev operates as the brain of strategic aviation. Prototype hangars, sensor laboratories, radar workshops, and entire sectors dedicated exclusively to the aircraft Moscow cannot afford to lose, because it simply cannot replace them quickly. And it was inside this vital center that one of the most symbolic blows of the war took place: the destruction of the A-60. The A-60 was not a regular military aircraft, it was a flying laboratory created in the 1980s, built on the Il-76 and modified with a retractable turret carrying an airborne laser. Its purpose? To blind or damage satellites in low orbit. In other words, a space weapon. Something only the Soviet Union had the industrial and technological capacity to build at the peak of its scientific power. Modern Russia has never been able to recreate all the components of that system. Many suppliers, laboratories, and processes disappeared along with the Soviet collapse. That is why the A-60 was treated like a jewel, unique, experimental, and irreplaceable. It was the kind of project Moscow protected not for what it already did, but for what it could do in the future, including high-power laser projects that were being reactivated precisely in Taganrog. And then came the irony that turned into a running joke even among military analysts. One of Russia's most futuristic weapons, built to attack satellites, was destroyed by drones that cost less than a used pickup truck. While the A-60 depended on decades of Soviet engineering, advanced optics, space targeting systems, and equipment that no longer even has a production line, Ukraine used adapted Neptune missiles and domestically built jet-propelled drones, Bars and Molnaya. All national, all inexpensive, all far too embarrassing for the Kremlin to admit. And here is the part that truly scares Moscow. An asset that took nearly 40 years to keep alive disappeared in a matter of seconds, and with it, part of Russia's ambition to play a dominant role in space warfare. But that was only the first shock, because what happened outside the hangars, to the bombers, the radars, and the systems Beriev was trying to preserve, was even worse. If the A-60 was Russia's experimental jewel, What surrounded it was even more critical: the practical, real, operational backbone of Russian strategic aviation. And when the massive hangars in Taganrog began to explode, the Kremlin realized the strike was not just symbolic, it was surgical. Inside those warehouses were several Tu-95 MS aircraft, the long-range bombers that launch most of the cruise missiles used against Ukraine. They are the heart of the weekly attacks that hit infrastructure, energy facilities, and cities. Moscow depends on them because almost all of its more modern models are limited or in low availability. And here is the problem: the Tu-95 MS is old, complex, slow to maintain, and practically impossible to replace. These are giant turboprop engines, aging avionics, and systems that require heavy maintenance. Exactly the kind of service that could only be performed in Taganrog. Every aircraft damaged, there is not the loss of one plane. It is the loss of entire attack cycles. It is less capacity to saturate Ukrainian defenses. It is months of delays in repairs that were already overdue. But none of that comes close to the disaster involving the A-50s, Russia's airborne radar aircraft. All of Russia has fewer than 10 operational A-50s, and some of them have already been destroyed in previous attacks. These aircraft act as the eyes of the Air Force. They detect missiles, coordinate fighters, guide intercepts, and warn about deep strikes. Without them, Russia loses situational awareness and starts reacting too late. And guess where the only place capable of repairing, modernizing, and keeping any damaged A-50 operational was? Taganrog. With the complex hit, Moscow is left with a fleet that is not only small, it is fragile. Without AWACS, Russian fighters fly blind, relying only on ground-based radars that can be deceived, saturated, or destroyed. Worse, without the A-50s, Russia cannot accurately detect Ukrainian missiles crossing its defenses. It is like fighting in the dark while the enemy turns on a flashlight. Ukraine did not just destroy aircraft. It destroyed Russia's ability to protect itself. And that explains why the next strike, in Novorossiysk, hit Moscow like a punch to the gut. Because that one was not just military, it was economic. After destroying Russia's airborne intelligence in Taganrog, Ukraine did something the Kremlin never imagined. It shifted the axis of the operation. In a matter of hours, the targets stopped being strategic in the air and became strategic in the wallet. And that is why Novorossiysk and Tuapse entered the map. These two ports are not simple terminals, they are economic arteries. Most of the petrodollars that sustain Putin's war budget flow through them: crude oil, refined products, and shipments that feed both the domestic market and exports to China and India. It is a constant stream of money that the Kremlin depends on to maintain troops, artillery, logistics, and the entire apparatus that burns through billions every month. When Ukrainian drones began hitting the Sheskharis and Tuapse terminals, the impact was not just operational, it was psychological. Moscow's partners, especially Beijing and New Delhi, saw that routes considered safe were vulnerable. And any risk of disruption in oil flow means higher costs, contract renegotiations, and uncertainty for two of the few buyers still keeping Russia's economy afloat. One detail analysts highlighted: the strike was deep enough to show capability, but limited enough to avoid an immediate total collapse. In other words, it was a warning, not a finishing blow. A way of saying, we can shut down your ports whenever we want. Meanwhile, another message came from the sea. A large Russian landing ship from Project 1171 was hit. It is the same type of ship used to move troops, vehicles, and ammunition between Russia and Crimea. And the fact that it was struck in Novorossiysk, far from the front line, theoretically out of reach, exposed something the Black Sea Fleet had been trying to hide. No Russian ship is truly safe. If Ukraine can hit a ship of that size that far south, it means that entire bases, depots, and maritime routes can be reached by drones that cost a fraction of the systems used to shoot them down. And it is exactly at this point that the Kremlin began to panic. Because after the military impact and the economic damage came the most unexpected blow: the psychological strike that turned entire cities inside Russia into zones of chaos. If the military and economic strikes had already put Moscow on the defensive, what came next hit directly at what Putin most promised his people: security. Because on the same night Taganrog was burning and Novorossiysk was exploding, sirens began blaring in several Russian cities. Only this time, it was not the government in control. Ukrainian hackers breached regional alert systems and triggered extremely serious messages, warnings of a nuclear attack, threats of a chemical agent, instructions telling civilians to take iodine tablets immediately. It was chaos. Families running to shelters, supermarkets packed within minutes, schools shutting down. And the most humiliating part, there was no official explanation for hours. Meanwhile, videos began circulating showing a brutal contrast. On one side, Russian cities in complete panic, sirens screaming, parents desperately trying to understand whether the threat was real. On the other side, Putin appeared on television at ceremonial events, smiling, cutting ribbons, shaking hands, as if nothing was happening. The metaphor that went viral in Russia was immediate. While the country is on fire, the leader is drinking beer. A government disconnected from the crisis it created. For many Russians, that was the moment the Kremlin's narrative finally broke. Putin's promise was always clear. You may not have freedom, but you will have security. And that night, that exact pact was shattered. Because if hackers can seize control of basic civilian systems, what is stopping a real attack from going unnoticed? Psychological warfare works like this. It does not need to kill to break confidence. It only needs to make the people realize the state can no longer protect them, not even within their own borders. The most uncomfortable point for the Kremlin was not the destruction itself, it was how that destruction happened. Because, contrary to what Moscow always claims, Ukraine did not need NATO missiles, F-16 fighters, or foreign assistance to strike deep. Every blow that night was delivered with national technology. The star of the offensive was the modified version of the Neptune, the same missile that sank the cruiser Moskva. Only now it was reprogrammed to strike land targets with meter-level precision. At the same time, the jet-powered Bars and Molniya drones went into action, flying low, fast, and invisible to many Russian radars. And that was exactly what exposed the greatest humiliation of the operation. Ukrainian drones hit targets located less than 700 meters from an S-400 battery. The S-400, sold by Putin as the most powerful air defense system in the world, simply did not react. It did not identify, did not intercept, did not protect. It was outmaneuvered by cheap, small, almost disposable drones, the kind of threat the system was supposedly 100% capable of stopping. That single detail collapses Russia's entire fortress doctrine, the idea that layering defenses is enough to make any region inaccessible. Ukraine proved the opposite. It showed there is no wall high enough when the enemy knows exactly where to strike, what to strike with, and when to strike. And if Russia cannot protect its strategic arsenal inside its own territory, the question now is, what remains of the myth of Moscow's military power? And that is what ties the entire operation together, because the final blow of that night reveals that this war is entering a new stage. That night's strike completely changes Ukraine's position on the board. Even before negotiations begin, Zelensky arrives with something no political agreement could ever give him, an undeniable demonstration of real military capability. He proved he can hit the heart of Russia's infrastructure using only national technology, and that Moscow cannot stop him. On the other side, Putin enters the worst dilemma of the war. If he agrees to negotiate now, he will look weak in front of his own allies, and worse, in front of his own people. Exactly the political spectre he has always tried to avoid. But if he continues the war, he risks something even more dangerous: internal erosion. Civil panic, economic pressure, a neutralized air fleet, and ports under attack create a scenario that Moscow no longer fully controls. The result is clear. Ukraine showed that the Russian war machine is not indestructible. It is dismantleable, and piece by piece, from the space laser to the strategic bomber, from the oil port to the S-400 battery, from psychological protection to economic security. The bear has not been knocked down. It has been blinded. And if this happened in a single night, what could come next? Now, before you go, there's one detail you need to see. While this strike was dismantling Russia's military structure, Kiev launched another operation that caught Moscow completely off guard. Right at the moment, Trump was talking about peace. Click on the video appearing on your screen and see how Russia went into emergency mode in a matter of minutes. See you there.